Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar titled Bringing Psychologists to the Fight Against Deep Poverty, presented by Dr. Rosie Phillips Davis. And this program is sponsored by APA Division 18 Psychologists in Public Service. I'm Tiffany Fennell, President of Division 18. And before I introduce our speaker today, I just want to let our attendees know that Dr. Phillips Davis welcomes your questions. We've set up a Q&A feature here in Zoom where you can enter your questions. And this way we can keep better track of your questions as opposed to their getting lost in the chat box. And we'll have time towards the end of today's webinar for Dr. Phillips Davis to respond to your questions. I also want to let you know that this program is eligible for continuing education credit. So if you're interested in claiming credit, I will be giving instructions for how to do so at the end of today's webinar. Okay, so on to introductions. It is my honor to introduce Dr. Rosie Phillips Davis. She is a professor of counseling psychology at the University of Memphis, who earned her doctorate from the Ohio State University. She served as the 2019 president of the American Psychological Association, on the APA Finance Committee, APA Board of Directors, the American Psychological Foundation Board, and is past president of the Society of Counseling Psychology. She's also served on several editorial boards, including currently on the Journal of Career Assessment, has authored numerous articles and book chapters, and co-edited 2 books. Her awards include the Janet E. Helms Award for Mentoring and Scholarship, Elder by the National Multicultural Conference and Summit, of which she's a co-founder, and Distinguished Professional Contributions to Institutional Practice for APA Award. There are 2 funds named in her honor at the University of Memphis, the Rosie Phillips Bingham Book Scholarship and the Dr. Rosie Phillips Bingham Emergency Student Fund. Thank you so much for being here today, Dr. Rosie Phillips Davis, and sharing your expertise with us. I'll turn the mic over to you now.
Okay, well, thank you, Tiffany. And it is so interesting to me that I can't see anybody, but that's okay. So what I'm going to do is share my screen, and we will begin. So I'm pretty sure that you all can see that because I asked Tiffany if she could see it. So what I'm going to do today is do my best to talk and do and move the slides as well. You would think I would have this down since that is all I do these days. Let's see if we can get to. So one of the things that I had to do was turn in some objectives to Tiffany so that we could make this all official. You can see what those are, describing poverty and deep poverty and some consequences, opportunities for psychologists to work and to find the deep poverty toolkit. So what I want to do is tell you the Rosie story. This is probably the thing that influences my work on deep poverty, and some of you maybe will have heard it on a TED Talk. If you haven't, you can find it. I usually ask when I'm talking to people in person, I ask, do you know what a shotgun house is? And probably the saddest answer I ever had to that question was from a kid who was in about the 7th grade. And he said, well, I don't know what a shotgun house is, but I know what a gun is. And in these times, that is not the answer that we want to hear. So the Rosie story. So she lived in a 4-room shotgun house with 8 of her 11 siblings. That meant in this little dull, gray, shedding paint-colored house, the first room was the living room. The next room belonged to Madeir, her mother, and Jake, her father. Then came the 3rd room where all the children slept, followed by the kitchen with a small bathroom attached. And actually there was no bathtub. The children took a bath in a tin tub. Rooms were about 10 by 10 linoleum floors or wood where you could step on them sometimes and get a splinter. Self-applied wallpaper, cheap furniture, including a couch in the living room that grew lumpy from Rosie choosing to sleep there after she tired of sleeping in beds where she might awaken to a foot in her mouth from one of her sisters who slept in the same bed with two people at the head of the bed and two people at the foot of the bed, and Rosie. Or Rosie might awaken to a large, warm, wet spot when one of the children had an accident. Plus, Rosie liked to stay up late watching TV or reading. And she only watched TV after they got a television when she was about 10 or so years old. When she was in 7th grade, she did her own hair because her mom had stopped doing it years earlier when Rosie had let one of her sisters cut her bangs over Medea's objections. So Rosie periodically burned plugs out of her hair as she used 2 hot straightening combs and curlers to smooth and fix her nappy hair. Rosie was dark-skinned, and on her way to school, it was usual for children to shout out, "Ooh, you so black and ugly." And they just laugh at her. Well, maybe she was black and ugly. She had short nappy hair in a world they called good hair, long and straight like that on white folk. She had dark skin in a world that said, if you're light, you're all right. If you're black, get back. She was shy, wore ill-fitting clothes, shoes with run-over heels that often had cardboard in the sole to cover the hole to keep her feet from touching the ground. And I sometimes wonder if the only thing that would have completed that outfit would have been a too big pair of glasses. But she never had her eyes examined until she was 18. She felt badly about herself because she believed the taunts and a dark cloud hung over her head. And the family hung their clothes out after they had rinsed them in that tin tub. They hung them out on a clothesline that hung across a dirt backyard that was shared with the neighbors. Medea, the mom, was creative about making sure children got enough to eat, so she would make big pots of beans and cornbread, and she would season the beans with fat back. And when there was only enough of that fat back for Jake the father to have a bite, and sometimes when his garbage man salary would not stretch far enough, Medea would have to be creative with a piece of meat when there weren't any beans. And so she would cook the meat and make gravy, and the children would eat cornbread and gravy and save the meat for tomorrow's gravy. So how does a severely poor kid like Rosie make it? What happens to her? And severely poor meant that the poverty line was under $6,000, and her father Jake made about $3,000. And actually, he was a garbage man in Memphis, Tennessee, during the sanitation strike when Dr. Martin Luther King came to fight for those workers. And so when we look at what happens to poor people, we have to begin to know that Rosie was just one among millions of poor people who are in the United States. Right now, and year after year, there are nearly 40 million people who live in poverty in the United States. Rosie wasn't that different, and 46% live in deep poverty. And one of the things about living in that Rosie family is that her sisters and brothers who were 10 years younger lived in poverty. And so they would tell stories. Baby sister Carrie would tell a story about having go-go boots where sometimes the sole would come off, but she glued them back together. But she didn't live in deep poverty, so she had more than one pair of shoes. She wore those go-go boots by choice. Over 12% of the people in the United States regularly live in poverty. When we look worldwide, we find that there are 220 million people who are unemployed, people who want to work but can't work. And I just find it unacceptable. And I would challenge you to find what is unacceptable to you. And I know that things are because you're a public service psychologist. With the war in Ukraine. And when I look at those devastating pictures of all of those people, and we talk about, and when I first started putting this slide presentation together, there weren't any refugees, and then there were 500,000, and then there were 1,000,000. And then when I went to work on it again on Sunday, there were 2 million people, and it's growing. There are like over 5 million refugees in Syria, and 70% live in poverty. And so you know that even right now with Ukraine, many of those people leaving have the ability, the money to leave. So many more won't, and that poverty rate is just going to grow. I find it unacceptable that nearly 1 billion people live on $2 a day with their family. And everywhere, 75% of the poor are women and children. So what is poverty now? So we have a federal definition of poverty. Right now is 2 adults and 2 children living on about $26,500. And that means the amount of money that it takes to have a basic food diet, not everything else. And it's adjusted every year. So it goes up slightly every year. So when you look at deep poverty is half of what the poverty line is. So when I describe that Rosie's scenario and her sister, they live in completely different amounts of money. In the case of Rosie's family, that deep poverty line, that poverty line was about $2,500 a year with 9 children. So I just find those kinds of things unacceptable when we look at what happens with poor individuals. I looked up Division 19 to be clear on psychologists and public service, and saw that it's comprised of 5 areas: community and state hospital psychologists, criminal justice, police and public safety, psychologists in Indian country, and veteran affairs. So I picked up some things about poverty through for some of those groups. Now, when I really decided, I was listening to the radio one day and heard a report about from pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. And the story talked about how in the world, if you're in the bottom percentile, your chances for reaching the top percentile anywhere in the world is about 15%. And if you live in the United States, your chances for reaching the top quintile is only 12.9%, and that's in San Jose, California. And what caught my attention was that if you live in Memphis, Tennessee, your chances are 3%. I was doing a sit-up and stopped midway through the sit-up and said 3%. That means I live in Memphis. I'm a miracle. But when we look around the country, it is just amazing. Now, what Chetty and Hendren, the researchers who found this, they did find that neighborhoods influence whether one gets an opportunity to get out of poverty, and that it impacts how much money you're going to earn when you are older. So looking at what happens with poverty in the United States, and much of this will not be a surprise to you, sometimes it's interesting. What I would encourage you to do is to look at your city or county where you live and see what the poverty rate is. Because one of the things I know about poverty is if you're not in it, you get to avoid it. You don't have to see it. But I've done this presentation in so many states in the United States, and I find that these numbers don't change very much. The only significant difference is based on the number of a particular racial or ethnic group that is in your city. So across the United States, when you look, and these numbers, I think maybe from 2016, 2018, they don't change that much. Overall poverty in the United States. Then when we look at what happens with white, Black, Latino, Asians, and Indigenous Americans, almost everywhere, Indigenous Americans and Black people will change places. Sometimes Latinos, but those are the 3 that are at the bottom, almost everywhere. So you can look at Tennessee and you see how it changes just a bit. And I always want to talk about Memphis because I don't ever want to talk about somebody else's area without looking at my own. And you can see, and when you look at that Indigenous rate, you wonder why. That's because there are hardly any Indigenous people that I'm aware of in Tennessee, in Memphis, Tennessee. And so the numbers change and they look very different. I hope that you will look at what is going on in your area. I put Knoxville up there because that's where the Tennessee Vols play, and they'll have a stadium filled with 100,000 football fans, and it's just all this orange and white. And yet, when I looked at when I looked at when I looked at Knoxville, and looked at the poverty rate for white individuals here, this was shocking. I said it almost looks like the black poverty rate in Nashville. It's shocking to me, but it just goes to show that poverty does not care what your race, ethnicity is, although there are benefits to some groups. So when you look at, oh goodness me, when you look at the poverty rate in the US, you can see what it tends to look like. And this is the percentage of poverty within the group. This is not comparing one group to another. So when you look at the number of indigenous and Native Alaskans, 27% of them live in poverty. When you look at black people in the United States, it's almost 20%, and you can see what Asian and white is. So part of the individuals that you work with are veterans. So I wanted to just highlight a little bit about veterans. Veterans overall have a less of a poverty rate than in the than the population, general population. But nevertheless, who wants to talk about a country where people who are serving our country, 1.5 million veterans live below the federal poverty line, and another 2.4 million live paycheck to paycheck? The homelessness, and when we look at the homelessness rate for about a single night is 37,000. But when you look at any one night sleeping on the street, it's about 60,000 people. 50% of homeless vets are white, 92% are male, 92% are male. And you know, when we're talking about looking across at all areas, when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I believe that means including everybody. So here is, you can see the poverty rate by age, and you can see where we have most of the poverty in our among our veterans, and it's younger groups. Okay, so it goes in income by poverty, looking at the 65 and older. I'm sorry, looking at 65 and older, and what happens to that group. Criminal justice system. So that is just a big area. And of course, one of my favorite people working with you is Dr. Battistini. And so she has brought this notion of criminal justice to us in a big way. And I know about the criminal justice system because living where I live, I know there are a lot of people involved, have family members involved, and so on. So it's here. But to begin to talk about what it is. Poverty is a predictor of those involved in the criminal justice system. Poverty is an outcome for those involved in the criminal justice system. And I think that this is pretty profound. What we find when you look at people who go to jail, they are disproportionately with incomes under $10,000 a year. Our criminal justice system is very discriminatory, very pointed at poor people. When you look at incarceration rates by 100, and when you look at these rates by race, it is probably not at all surprising to those of you who work in the criminal justice system that this is what it looks like. That populating prisons and jail, overwhelmingly Black, overwhelmingly brown. And so when we look at this, you say, what are those people? Do those people have more criminality? I don't think so. I don't think so. You could tell me what you think. So I looked at, when you start counting people who are incarcerated, you look at people in local jails, by states, people held in U.S. Marshal Services, youth who are in facilities, just as involved, people involuntarily committed to all kinds of confinement. So when we begin to look at those numbers, it is striking to me that when we look at these numbers and we look at what is happening to these are people incarcerated per 100,000 people. So what this does, it looks at world incarceration rates. And so when we look at the place, if it were a country that incarcerates the most people, it would be Louisiana. And then there's my state of Tennessee. And then we look at, for the United States, incarcerations per 100,000. And then we move over and look at, this is looking at if Tennessee were a country, it out incarcerates people in the United Kingdom, Iceland, and so on. And if we looked in my city, it probably would be pretty great too. So I put this in so that you can see where the United States ranks. And then when we go down to some of these other countries, Massachusetts is down pretty low, but you look down at Fiji. So when you're looking at incarceration rates, and if we know this, and if we know that poverty is a predictor of who's incarcerated, and poverty is an outcome of incarceration, we should not be surprised by what is happening with poverty in many of our cities and states. And I guess the question becomes, and so what, and what is it that you do about it? And then there are the children. You know, when I look at what is happening with people coming over from Ukraine, I'm so glad that they are putting up pictures of children, innocent looking children, that we can see, because I'm hoping that what it does is pulls on our heartstrings. Because remember, I just said that 75% of the people living in poverty are women and children. And when you look at what happens to children, about 1 billion children worldwide, and this says they're multidimensionally poor. So when you think about poor, you think about their health, thinking about access to water and food. 365 million children are living in extreme poverty. And remember, I told you what it is for the United States, but in the world, it's forced to live on less than $1.90 a day. I usually round that off to $2 a day. If you hear a noise in the background, there's somebody vacuuming, and I don't have a door. Tiffany, let me know if it gets too loud and I need to go say, shut that vacuum off. Children are more than twice as likely to live in poverty as adults. Children from the poorest households die at twice the rate of their better off peers. And so poverty is really bad for your health. It affects your education. Children who are less well off, the poor kids, when you compare them to their more well off children, they're behind by 26 reading points by the time they reach 4th grade. And those of you who are working in school systems, I hope some of you do know that. And public schools now are beginning to be the place where more and more poor kids are educated. I told you that poverty affects health. 1 billion people die from tropical diseases. And in 2021, something that we can be vaccinated against, 1.5 million people died from tuberculosis. Poor people at a 50% higher risk for heart disease. And scarcity makes us make poor decisions. And I put like that of my brother, because one of the things I love about living in my family is that I get to see poor people all the time. So with my brother a few years ago, he lost his job, and he lost his job because he was a social worker, and he worked taking children out of dangerous situations with their parents. They gave him a computer laptop, told him to take it home and work on it. So he brought it home to Memphis. He lives in Nashville. Brought it home to Memphis and was staying with one of my sisters, and his 13 or 15-year-old stepson was there. And they all went out to party, and he let the kid get on the computer. When he took the computer back to work and his supervisor wanted to use it, she found something that got him fired. And anybody who has dealt with young teenage boys know that you found pornography on it, because those age kids are the biggest consumers of pornography. And of course, in that situation, I told him, I said, yeah, I would have fired you too. But he's diabetic. And what he ended up doing when he didn't have money was not buying his medication so he could feed his child, not knowing that that decision would cost him his life if it lasted for very long. Luckily for me, I was on the APA board of directors, and when I went on the board, I didn't know they gave you a stipend. At that time, they gave us something like $12,000, and it wasn't in my budget, so I just gave him money. But that decision, or if you think about farmers, what Shafir and Malanathan have found is that one of the ways, look at farmers and the decisions they make during planting season versus harvesting season. So that's why when you look at poor people and you wonder about some of the decisions, scarcity makes us make poor decisions. And then this death by despair. When we look at one of the things that struck me as I was looking at poverty rates in like the 2016s and 2017s, was looking at counties where we were losing manufacturing jobs and coal mining jobs. And I was so struck by the fact that now there were groups of white individuals who were dying earlier than Black people. And I said, how in a country like the United States do we do that? It's because we discriminate so well when it comes to poverty. And some people will think that poverty is worse in urban areas, and that is actually what we think about when we see poverty. But in reality, it's worse in rural areas. You will find in some places in rural areas, there is not a pediatrician. There are 1 million kids where there's not a pediatrician within a few miles of where they live. They're food deserts. And sometimes people are very prideful and don't want to come and get the food that is there. And you all saw the lines and whatnot during the COVID pandemic. What you don't see is that happens every day in the United States, not in such numbers and not with a camera running. But what are we to do when the majority of Americans believe living standards for the poorest Americans are an ash or is an important national issue? A lot of people don't believe that. Poverty is due to external circumstances, not because of the oops. Okay, let's go back one. So what ends up happening is that we end up actually blaming poor people for being poor. We end up thinking that somehow they ought to do more. So what I did when I agreed to run for president of APA was say, okay, if I run, I'm going to use that microphone for something and see if there's anything that we can do in science, practice, or education to begin to make a difference in the lives of poor people. And we did find that we needed to change attitudes, change policies, and change practice. That was our goal. If you want to find out about it, here's the website for it. All you've got to do is go up there and say, look at just type in your browser, APA and the Deep Poverty Initiative, and you will find it. And you will find that there one of the videos that I would hope that you would look at is when we did a deep poverty challenge. And there's a video, and it's old now, but it has on there that we needed to examine some things, examine how people think about welfare, and how people look at, why do Americans hate welfare? They hate it. What do they think about people being too dependent? And often wonder, is poverty an acceptable part of being, because we're capitalists? So here's what a lot of Americans believe, that poor people become too dependent. It's not the responsibility of the government. It is acceptable Most people are not aware of the structural causes, and most people hold negative racial stereotypes and beliefs relating to poverty. Most of the times when we say poverty in this country, unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know, we think of Black people, even though numerically there are more poor white people in poverty than there are Black and brown people combined. But nobody knows that because it's not the image. That doesn't make as compelling a story. We need to examine stereotypes. What are some of our own biases and stereotypes we have, and how do these affect our solutions to poverty? We need to look at systems, affordable housing, education. You know, there was a time when we paid more for education than we do now. We find, and actually it's an interesting statistic, that the people with the most debt coming out of schools are African American women, Black women coming out have the most debt. Why is that? Talked a little bit about the criminal justice system, the healthcare system. Now, here's a place where poor people just, it almost blows my mind. If we were doing a discussion, if I were talking to a bunch of healthcare workers, I would tell you about how a Black baby is 3 times more likely to die if it's in being delivered by a white doctor than by a Black doctor. I would tell you the story of my own stepdaughter dying from from needing a heart because she kept going to the doctor. She was poor, kids live in different states. She went to the emergency room, is outside the emergency room crying, calls her dad saying, I'm sick and they're telling me to go home because there's a belief that Black people can endure pain more. Her dad calls the emergency room. He tells her, go back in there, calls them, and insists that they look at her again. They put her in the hospital and say, I'm sorry, Mr. Davis, your daughter needs a heart transplant. And within 2 weeks, she was dead. So we need to engage with stepholders. We need to organize. We need to learn about the steps that we have. I'm rushing through. If anybody wants to look at any, you can go and look at some of the things that are online. You can figure out who your local stakeholders are. And then you want to empower individuals to make a change. There is an advocacy kit that you can take and I'll show you one example from it. Here are 10 tips though for when you're talking about poverty. You got to figure out how to connect. And one of the things that psychologists must do is have the data and then also have stories. So you just got to document whatever it is that you find. And as I say, use stories and help figure out solutions. You can ask people what they need. They know what they need. So you got to create a narrative and lift up voices. One of the things that some students did in my class was I won't probably get a chance to talk to you about my work with the Women's Foundation for Greater Memphis, but some students in one of my advocacy classes took on going to talk to some people who were poor, hearing their stories. Legislation was up for temporary assistance to needy families, and what they were able to do was to get those stories from those individuals and present them to a legislator who didn't even know that it was time for the legislation to be up, but made a significant difference in getting that passed. So there is the advocacy. There's a great piece, a roadmap to reducing child poverty. I wish you would find that and take a look at that. And actually, what we did find, well, this is an old slide, that the American Rescue Plan did cut poverty. Now, the problem is they didn't keep it. So, and it's not unusual that if you don't keep a program within 5 years, sometimes those people who are poor will be right back in poverty. That's the website for the Poverty Kit. I think Tiffany already put it in there. Here's an example of something from that toolkit. This is an action guide for practitioners. And so you can go on there and actually work with this guide if you want to do something to begin to make a difference. In the small letters up there, I like it that you see that 60% of psychologists never, rarely, or only occasionally provide services to people who are unemployed. 61% of psychologists never, rarely, only occasionally provide services to people in working poverty. They have a job, they're still poor. And 92% of psychologists, never, rarely, only occasionally, provide services to unhoused people. So you can begin to take a look at a guide like that. Okay, let's see. That's the end of it. So, but one of the things that you want to do when you're working with poverty is make sure that you see that we're all in this together. You got to do images. You got to do the research. You got to have some spokespeople. You got to be telling the story and not make it too much. You can't overwhelm. People don't want too much that will overwhelm them. So what can you do? Ask yourself, what steps can you take to keep yourself informed? And then how do you inform others? How can you lobby your local government? When is the next town hall? Can you arrange a visit to any of your legislators? I know the APA Advocacy Conference is coming up, and those psychologists will get a chance to visit with legislators. Maybe some of you will do that. And if you don't know about it, you can talk to Catherine McGuire at the Chief Advocacy Office at APA, and she could tell you about that. And it could be about any of the things that are on your agenda. I like this quote: "A true end to poverty will require some combination of widely available jobs that pay living wages, a safe and affordable housing, an accessible and affordable healthcare system, widespread access to credit and financial markets, and the elimination of the poverty traps that decrease the labor supply. Any one of these changes will require massive amounts of political and financial investment and a significant shift in the way our society understands poverty." What can you do? Understand poverty where you are. Get a vision and then select a part of the vision that matches your skills. Develop and implement a plan that includes community scientists. And here with community scientists, of course, I mean those people who are actually living in that circumstances. I told you about my advocacy class that I taught last semester, what the students did. This semester, as we were talking about community scientists, I said, and they wondered, I said, well, sure. And I have a sister who lives in a very poor area. She makes about $1,200 a month from Social Security. And I said, you want me to call her now? She'll be a community scientist. She can tell you what's important in her neighborhood. So right in my class, I called her. And I said, well, what do you need to have happen in your neighborhood? And she said, we need to find out why so many people are shooting. What is going on? The amazing thing is that I was at her house yesterday and she said, you know what, Rosie, I went and asked some other people in the neighborhood about it. And so if you use those individuals, they will help you know what to do. So develop a plan, implement that plan, measure your results, adjust your plan, form productive partnerships. No change will happen with what you can do, and become a real advocate for, and then I just say dream big. But it's okay to start small. Do whatever it is that you're able to do, any little thing. We were talking about Ukraine today on a call I was on just before this one, and people talking about what you could do. Well, there are all kinds of ways to donate, or the other thing that I found that I just did was give somebody some money for some gas. You since you're a psychologist, you may have some more access than what they have. If anybody wants references, I'll give them to Tiffany and she can make those available to you so that you can read some more about these kinds of things. And I'm going to stop there for a moment for questions and answers. And if you don't have any, then I can tell you about this project that we did with the Women's Foundation. But I'm going to, let's see, if I stop sharing, I'm not going to see anybody anyway. Am I, Tiffany?
No, because I have it on the webinar feature. So.
Okay, so what we can do is look to see. I really, really would like for us to have a bit of a discussion, even though you all don't see each other, but they'll be able to talk. Can you allow anybody to actually answer their questions, or is it only you and me? Do we have all the power?
Let me see. If people do actually want to talk, I guess you could let me know in the signal to me and maybe the Q&A or the chat, and I could at least promote you to panelist so you have access to your mic or video. So yeah, we could do that, make it a little bit more dynamic of an interaction. So just let me know. Yeah.
I see
And
the question. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Tiffany.
I was just gonna say there is a question in the Q&A so far.
Yeah, I see that one. I think that's Thoraya. Is that how I pronounce your name? Those numbers are for all psychologists. They're not specific to the division. They're not divided out like that. I don't know if there are ways to, I would assume that they are talking about people who actually have an opportunity to that's a good question to look to see how did they come up with all those numbers. But my understanding is that it's not about those just psychologists who work with people who are in poverty, because what happens is that psychologists end up having to make money, and most psychologists in practice want to see people who can pay. That is very legitimate. There are even some psychologists who won't take insurance because insurance doesn't pay enough. But when we did the APA convention in 2019, because I asked that question, I did find some psychologists who can see poor people, not just pro bono, but work out a system to actually make it work and earn money. But we don't teach anything about how to help psychologists to see poor people. Actually, we don't teach anything about practice. And so we really and truly probably ought to add something about the practice of psychology. And if we really want to make a difference, and if we really want to see some people in poverty, then begin to show people how they can do it. Now, anybody can do it for pro bono, and it doesn't have to take a lot. A lot of us do a lot of things for pro bono. I mean, I do a lot of pro bono speaking, or don't get paid enough money that makes very little difference in my per hour amount of money. So we could. Okay. Women's networks are critical. How did you facilitate that effort? Is this about the Women's Foundation that I'm putting up in front of you? This is from Dr. Edward Corber. Can you say some more about what that question is? Yes. So, so I can tell you the story about the Women's Foundation, and they have them in various places around town. But in this particular one, what happened here, the Women's Foundation for Greater Memphis, we formed this organization back right in the early 90s. And actually, I had been in something called Leadership Memphis. And a woman who'd been my roommate, because we did a session downtown, walked up to me one day and said, "Hey, Rosie, you want to be a part of a group that help women and girls reach their full potential?" And I said, "Heck yeah," because I'm thinking, I maybe could do some assertiveness training groups or something. Well, when we got in the group, it turns out there was a woman whose name was Myrtie Buckman, had given about $65,000 to the Community Foundation. And she, so Tiffany, are you hearing that noise? Okay, let me go tell her to stop. Hold on just a second. Yes,
it's really not too
it's not too bad.
No.
Okay, all right. Maybe it's just distracting to me. So what we did though was just by asking that question, do you want to be a part of the group? And so probably about somewhere between 25 and 50 of us who said yes. And when we got together, it turns out that the idea was for us to raise money to give to people who are helping increase not just the capacity of women and girls, but women leading families, and so, or not necessarily leading families, but the mission down there to foster philosophy, foster leadership among, and support programs that enable women and children reach their full potential. So they switched from just women and girls to women and children. And I said, raise money. I don't know anything about raising money, but here's the deal: is that once you commit to it, we began to learn that raising money, and actually I went to a training sponsored by the Catalog Foundation for women of color, because we didn't do fundraising that much, and learned that it's not about me. This mission is not about me. It is about the person that you help. And they told us the very same thing that I'm telling you about community scientists. Get to know the people that you think that you're working for and working with. So one of the things that I did, went right back and began to know the people that I was raising money for. And so when I talked to the first woman that I talked to, she was almost a stereotype Black woman, you know, a poor woman with a missing tooth and she wanted to learn to repair computers before she run away from a domestic violence situation. And she said that she wanted to do things so that her 16-year-old and a young one, and one that she had just taken on, a baby, because she wanted them to have a better life and wanted them to see that they could do something different. So this group started. So on the 15-year anniversary, what the group decided to do, because it's a group also, what psychologists can influence is getting people to know that you gotta do the research data. And that's a valuable thing that we can add to it. So when we looked at the poverty sheet for Memphis in 2016, this is what it looked like. Our poverty rate is 28%. We chose a zip code 38126 because with something called Vision 2020, we said, is there a chance that we could reduce poverty by 5 points by our 20th anniversary? And chose this zip code because it had the highest poverty rate in Memphis with a childhood poverty rate of 78%. So we went to work in there talking to and it wasn't me, by the way, I'm busy doing other stuff, but went in, talked to the children, talked to the parents, got money from businesses, the Annie E. Casey Foundation, just going to work for it. And what are the things, and working with those individuals in that community, these were the goals that they said they need. Secure basic needs of the families, get marketable skills, get more children ready and into kindergarten. And the young people wanted some more positive outcome that included building their confidence, their character, and then financial education skills that help families to reduce poverty. Those goals were made in conjunction with the people who live there. And so by the end, it started in 2015, by the end of 2017, there had been 333 more people placed in jobs, 407 children enrolled in early child care, 850 youth participating in positive programs. They had 5 people who had purchased homes, a 20% increase in household income. Now, imagine that the average income in that zip code was only about $8,500. This is the latest. And I said, well, send me the latest result. And so here was the 5-year impact. So remember, I told you how many people have been placed in jobs, 330. 5-year impact, 1,730. People starting their small business, and let's see, from 5 people who had purchased homes to 16, a 53% increase in income. Now, the overall poverty rate had only been reduced by under 3%. And so we're not leaving the zip code, but what we decided to do was look to see if we could replicate it in some other zip codes. Build up this story more so that people could begin to see what was happening. You see what the number one goal is, not to let go of that progress. But the lesson that we have learned in all the time that I have been working with the organization is that we have to give voice, that to learn how to speak about, do a lot of things that are in that poverty kit. And we have to be guided by what the community partners, the community scientists are telling us. That's what we end up having to do. Okay, so I'm gonna stop my sharing right there. Okay, one problem we have, oh, hey, Deborah. One problem we have is in the media who imply, and they're reporting that poor people are primarily Black, Hispanic, or other minority groups. And psychologists help to correct this false narrative. That is such a beautiful question. And that would be one that I think it would be worthwhile to have a group to look at. You know, I accept the speaking engagements when people ask, but I do. And one of the things that I also wish that we could do more research on, and maybe it's out there and I don't know it yet, is on mindset, is who are the people who are doing the great research on mindset, and how can we take it and begin to apply it in all the settings where we are working. But I do think, unfortunately, the media, I mean, maybe I'm just cynical, but it's such a profit-making business that they want the headline. I mean, there are a couple of TV channels that I don't look at for my news because we call them the gun and knife show, because that's what they're going to lead with, and that's what they're going to tell, and that's what viewership does. One of the things about poverty and one of the things about racism and all of that is so based on stoking fear, and people pay attention when they fearful. And so you look at it and you think, oh, where is that? And I want to make sure I don't go there. So how do we, and all of you know that fear is one of the easiest emotions to instill, the hardest to get rid of. But knowing that, how do we in our communities go and do anything about that? I think for those of you who are working with criminal justice involved people, you'll know that that is one of the most fearful things. And anybody is subject to it. It's subject to it. I grew up very severely poor, but now I live in a house on a golf course on the 17th tee, and it's gated. Oh my God. First year I lived here, I found myself about a year after rushing home to get behind the gate because of thinking that it was safe. And when I found myself thinking that, I came home and I told my husband, I have developed behind the gate thinking, and I will not allow that. But it had to be intentional. I said, there's no way I'm going to let anything keep me from traveling all over Memphis the way I always have. But that mindset that we get there. So it's I hope some people will do some research on mindset, and I hope some individuals, I don't know, anybody out there has some notions about how psychologists can help correct the false narrative. I think we ought to add that to what we do. So if you do, drop it in the chat or in the question and answer so that we could see what it is. What is that? APA Outlook is going to answer this question. What is the rest of that?
I'm sorry. I was trying to clear the questions that were already answered. It looks like Dr. Korber was asking a follow-up question to an earlier question about moving young ones into the university as well.
Okay. And so a part of what they did was say what they wanted, and you can see those programs that were designated by youth. It was any of the programs that they thought would be of use to them, and yes, they are indeed one. We specifically were working in that neighborhood with Booker T. Washington High School. So begin to work with those students there and those guidance counselors. So it included everything from college to work that was just work they were doing when they got out of high school. So any of it. Yeah. I see that we've got about 2 or 3 minutes. Anybody else got one? Let me see. Okay, come on, people. We need to. And if you don't have a question, if you got a comment, we'll take that too. But it's the last couple of minutes, so if you do, we got about 1 minute, right, Tiffany?
That's right. I just wanted to say I really appreciate having some concrete steps, because it just seems like such an overwhelming problem. And like, what can me as one individual do? But I appreciate even seeing your example of what you've done in your own, community, and it in starting. Yes, you can dream big. That's great, but you can start small, and it just makes it seem much more doable. Yeah. So I really appreciate your helping to kind of lay out some concrete actions.
Well, you know, so something, and you can do it in your family. Sometimes it feels like doing it in the family doesn't make a difference. And I'll tell you one that I just did was looking at Ukraine and all those refugees and what is happening to all of those individuals. So I went online and donated. But what I did in my family, maybe I said that. I said, I know that I have a sister who's making like $1,200 a year from her Social Security check, and she's taking care of babies. Even one of her grandchildren left her uh, her sixth grade over there and said, well, you're gonna have told her daughter, you're gonna find your own way to school because poor people make poor decisions. That really meant her grandmother would have to take it. So what I did yesterday, I said, well, let me take her over some gift cards to buy some gas. On the way, I filled up my tank, and I realized that gift card ain't gonna do it. I'm gonna have to triple that for that poor person to. So it's a small thing, but it's helping a little kid get to school. Actually, it's gonna help even more than that. So the other thing, let me see, I saw something from Iva. Yeah, building it into our program. That's exactly right. Even the DEI, and I'll tell you, Iva, what I did when I started looking at DEI, I realized that even in my class, my career counseling class, that I didn't have my own reference on my sheet. So yes, so putting it into your curriculum, I think the things that those things, and Iva, since you spoke up also, what we have begun to push is when we don't pay enough attention to Indigenous people, make sure that you begin to include it no matter how little it is. That's what we have to do if we want to begin to change and work within what we're able to do. All right. Is that it for everybody? Well, I'm glad that you took time out to come today, and I look forward to seeing some of you when we're in person at APA in Minneapolis, the place of the George Floyd killing, so that we can really do something great.
Thank you so much for being here today and again, sharing your work, sharing all of this information. I hope people have some takeaways of maybe some practical things they can do. So really appreciate your time with us. Also, I want to thank our attendees for being here and asking such really great, thoughtful questions as well. I've put some information about how you can claim continuing education credit in the chat box, but I'll stay on a little while longer after this program ends if people have some lingering questions. And I do want to give a quick plug before you all step away that Division 18 is hosting a town hall in a month on Thursday, April 7th at 3 p.m. Eastern. The town hall is focused on APA's equity, diversity, and inclusion strategy and initiatives. And so we'll have Dr. Vanessa Hintz from the APA's EDI office, who will be with us to present on the wonderful things that are in the works and some of the resources already developed by APA. So I hope you can join us. I'll put the link to that information and how you can register for the town hall. It'll be over Zoom. So hope you can join us for that event too. So thank you, everybody.
And she's great and very accessible. Okay.
Yes.
On Zoom, I met her. Okay.
Oh, right. Yeah, she's great, very enthusiastic, and I'm excited about the things to come.
Great, great. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.